Okay, board, we'll get started. Should we wait for the superintendent? He should be back in a minute. Well, maybe we will wait just for, sorry. Just wait for a minute for the superintendent. Sorry about that. I didn't notice he wasn't here. Okay.
Are we doing this for Matt? So.
Yeah, for Matt. So, Matt. Okay. We are going to get started with our Committee of the Whole School Board meeting dealing with the boundary study update. Monday, November 18th, starting at 5:10, and Clerk Oswald is not here today, so Vice Chair Lowell will do the roll call, please.
Member Eder? Here. Member Kirby? Here. Member Loeffler-Kemp?
Here.
Member Sandstead? Here. Superintendent Gronseth? Here. Deputy Clerk Kathy Erickson? Here. That is roll call, Chair.
Okay, thank you. We have 5 members here, so we have a quorum. And so again, the purpose of today's meeting is to have an update on the boundary studies and we have with us Matt Sachs, who is Associate Director with the consulting company that we are working with for our boundary study, and he's been here a few times, but here all day meeting with folks, and so we want to welcome Matt Sachs with us. And would you like us to go around, or our nameplate's good?
No, I think I can see them.
Okay.
They're good.
Okay, great. Well, welcome again, Matt, and we look forward to this update and conversation on the work that you've been doing with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, School Board, for having me here tonight. Tonight, the goal of this presentation is really to give you an overview of the process and timeline, where we're at now, what's taken place, what's still to come, some background data just about the process and that we've been using with the groups we've been meeting with, the boundary work session groups that we had last month in October, and presenting also to the focus groups that we had today and that we'll have all day tomorrow and Wednesday morning. kind of walk you through what those groups did and had at their disposal as tools for creating some draft boundary scenarios when we met with them last week. And then, as mentioned, we met all day with focus group scenarios where we took that we took that work that was created in the boundary work sessions last month, and we siphoned it down into 4 draft scenarios that we're presenting to these focus groups and getting their feedback on before we decide which scenarios to roll out to the public as a whole. So we'll give you a kind of a high-level overview of what scenarios those focus groups have seen today, and then conclude with next steps. So I started meeting with the superintendent and his team and technology people and others back starting in June to sort of develop a baseline for the process, gathering data. We got a lot of GIS data from the county, as well as the student data file from the district, which we're able to geocode, and that's kind of a basis for a lot of what we're doing in developing boundaries. We looked at capacity of different schools and talked about some different criteria we might want to use when developing boundaries. So all of that was presented to the boundary development small groups back in October 15th and 16th. We used all of that baseline data to develop an interactive Excel tool where they could kind of on the fly move different areas and see what the impact to boundaries were, both on the number of students, the utilization of buildings, and different demographic factors. And we'll talk. I'll show you more about how that looked like here in a few minutes. So we have.
Excuse me, Matt, just a quick question. Do you want to present this slide with the process and timeline before you take questions? Would that be helpful for your presentation, or do you want questions throughout this first slide?
Whatever you would prefer. I was going to go through the process and then have some actual slides on the actual data and the tools, but if I'm fine with answering questions as we go. So.
Is that okay if we let him finish with at least the process and the timeline?
Yeah.
And then we'll have some questions. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So we had 3 4-hour work sessions in those boundary development meetings. I believe it was a total of 15 different small groups that worked together with this data to sort of give us ideas and draft boundary scenarios. We took all those scenarios back, reviewed them, looked at what was the same, seeing what was feasible with the goals of the district, and we brought those down to 4 sort of working draft scenarios that we're presenting to the focus groups here this week and getting their feedback on. So we'll take that additional layer of feedback, review it again, and probably make some tweaks. The boundary options, we're presenting them this week. It's not, it's going to be this one, or this one. At all steps along the way, we're sort of taking feedback, and it's not really a vote. We're taking feedback to ultimately come to the best boundary recommendation later in 2020. So we'll take that feedback from the focus groups and then probably arrive at 2 or 3 scenarios for 2 open community meetings in January 22nd and 23rd. We'll present those options to the community, again, as a presentation with some background data, and then the format we use is to break people up into, again, small group tables, discuss them with fellow community members, and talk about what they like or dislike about a particular option, or what could potentially be changed to make it better. Earlier in the month of January, we'll put a survey and all of the materials online so that people can review them prior to coming to the meetings, and then likely leave it up for a week or 2 following the open community meetings. Typically, we get quite a large response from the online surveys. So then we'll study all of that feedback that we get probably over the course of February and have some internal work sessions with the district admin team and have a recommended scenario for you likely in February or March of 2020. So that's kind of the overall process.
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll open it up for a couple questions. One thing that might be helpful, Superintendent, can you review the process that you used to reach out to bring people to those first meetings in October? I know you sent, one of the ways was sent emails to us as board to suggest names and that, but could you just review that? So, okay, thanks.
Sure, we included principals from all the schools, teachers from all the schools, had principals identify parents from each school to be involved, reached out to board members to get some recommendations for other organizations. We reached out to organizations that we generally partner with and got quite a few community members and others to be involved. I think all in all we had about 80 people in the first phase. The second phase, again, we brought in the principals this morning, so they all went through. We brought in various staff members from all over the district this morning who serve in many different roles like paraprofessionals and clericals and some teachers and coordinators of programs. And then this afternoon we brought in teachers from all of our schools. The exception is that Lowell has representation from the Spanish program, the Ojibwe program, and the English program, and that was true in the first phase and in the second phase. Also, the immersion staff have their own session tomorrow afternoon as well. With it being such a big part of the conversation for Lowell and how to handle the success of these programs, we want to make sure that we're getting plenty of input there. And then Wednesday morning is parents from all the sites as well as community members of several partner organizations on Wednesday as well.
And we'll be meeting with high school students tomorrow as well during the day.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Okay, Member Sandstead?
Yeah, I had a question about the boundary development criteria, but I think you're going to actually get to that in a few slides.
Yes.
I'm wondering maybe if the superintendent can speak to how those criteria were developed, where they came from.
Some of the initial motivation was the demographic study that was done in 2014 and then repeated in 2017, showing that we had a few sites that were nearing their capacity. And then this year, last spring, really looking at our numbers, we saw that Congdon, Lester Park, to some degree Homecroft and Piedmont were reaching their full capacity, and actually now we have Congdon with about 110% of capacity, which means there are more students than can really fit in the building, given the other programming that we have. So that was one motivation. Another piece...
Can I sort of clarify?
Yep.
Less about what the criteria are, but how they were decided upon. Who was choosing what the criteria were and who was communicating that to...
You mean for developing boundaries within the working groups? Or?
Well, here it says that you received boundary development criteria from the district.
Oh,
and so
no, I did not receive any criteria from the district.
Okay.
We had an initial kickoff meeting, and we sort of discussed what some of the criteria were. You know, I gave them some things that are typically discussed, typically different criteria of, balancing utilization or not splitting neighborhoods, things like that. And we had a conversation about it, but also me not knowing the district, I just wanted to make sure all of the criteria,
Okay.
But when we worked with these groups, it wasn't you have to do this, and this. These were sort of some ideas to keep in mind, but obviously different people have different priorities. So,
Thank you. That's what I was looking for, the origin of the criteria. Okay, so.
Grant said if you want to finish what you were talking about in terms of the capacity study, or
Sure.
Yes.
Sorry, I misunderstood what you're looking for there. Yeah, it was just things that had come up over time, the capacity, the desire of parents that we heard from both Lowell and Myers-Wilkins, for there not to be a split between their feeders. So some of their students going to Denfeld, some going to East, and then from both of those schools. And then the differences in the numbers and demographics between the schools, and the conversations that we've had with the equity group regarding opportunities and access to courses. When you have fewer number of students, you have fewer number of sections, and so it's more difficult to schedule. And so that became another piece.
Okay, Member Eder.
Hi, I'm just pulled up on ISD 709, the boundary planning project, and under the purpose it talks about making sure that underserved community input into the decision-making process is incorporated. Could you talk a little bit about how that input, how that input, or where you sought out that input, sort of how that has been playing a role in this process?
Superintendent Grunstead.
When we were inviting people to be involved in the process, we reached out to the NAACP, our own integration staff, the equity group, to make sure that we had diverse voices included in the process.
Member Sandsted.
Thank you. Let's see here. We're doing the focus group meetings here in the next few days, and you said that we've narrowed to 4 scenarios for these meetings. Is that? Mm-hmm. And you said we, and I'm wondering if that's just cooperative strategies, if you've been working with the superintendent, and who has been the decision makers in narrowing down the scenarios.
There was some discussion between the superintendent and I, but primarily it was reviewing all of the initial 15 scenarios and trying to see, some of them had a lot of commonalities, and 15 is a large number for a group to review. So we tried to take what were the common factors in some and narrow it down to the 4 that we have today that kind of incorporated most of the ideas that we saw with all the working groups.
Okay. And then my last question is the community meetings in January presenting options. How many options will there be? Will it still be the 4, or will it be narrowed from there?
Having not finished the focus groups, I can't say that for sure. I would say it would likely be 2 or 3.
Okay.
When we're rolling this out to a whole community, again, getting through 4 options and gathering feedback on 4 is kind of a little high, but I would say probably 2 or 3.
Thank you.
Just a follow-up question. Is that really kind of best practices when you're working with the community, our size and...
Yeah, I would say that's pretty typical. We're following a process that we've done in many areas across the country. We kind of start with this 10,000-foot view, and we're looking at all of these different scenarios, and then we're then siphoning it down and getting feedback on those, and just sort of kind of refining as we go, but getting as much input and thoughts on them to do that.
Member Lofold?
Just a quick comment about our community meetings. I'm really glad they're on the calendar right now at this early stage. And I'm reaching out to my board members really and our superintendent to say, I really want us to be involved in how these meetings, or at least I want to know a little bit more. I don't want to make that, I'm going to make the decision. But, we've got the 2 dates. So I would really love to make sure they're out there in the public, make sure that, we're conscious about where we're having them, like not just in school sites, but like kind of what we talked about when we talked to our consulting firms, that we have to kind of maybe go to places too. But I'm really glad they're on the calendar. I really want to encourage us to really, I know you do, but I want the community to feel like they can come and view these.
Go ahead, Jeff. Matt?
Okay, moving on. So some of these slides we've probably already kind of touched on through the process and through some of the initial questions. Kind of why we're doing this boundary study. The superintendent already talked about some overcrowding at some of the elementary schools, specifically Congdon Park and Lester Park, above 110% utilization. And then even on the extreme other end, we have a school like Stowe that's right around 50% currently. Imbalance of enrollment at the middle and high schools, a roughly 400 student difference between the two middle schools, and upwards of 550 at the high schools, and also some big imbalance in the demographic percentages at the middle schools and the high schools, which we'll talk about. And also, as Superintendent Grantz alluded to already, just the expansion of Spanish immersion into 4th and 5th grade at Lowell over the next 2 years, and the potential additional classrooms that it will take up at that school and what that might mean. So I'm going to just walk you through some of the background data we collected, and this is what's been presented to these working groups as well. So we use a lot of GIS data and analysis in our process, and it's kind of the baseline for that interactive tool that we discussed. So we're able to actually geocode all of the district students onto a map based on their address provided, and we got a lot of data from the county, as I mentioned, like the attendance boundaries, school points, roads, parcel data sets, and that allows us to actually look at how many students live in each of the attendance boundaries and compare those to what schools they're attending, how close they are to different school points, and other geographic features. So that's kind of a baseline for a lot of what we're doing throughout this process. So based on that, we were able to create what we call a live-attend analysis, and this has been helpful, a helpful reference point in some of our discussions with these groups. So basically, it's a matrix table that sort of cross-references how many students live in a boundary with the school they're attending. So if you see the first row going across is Congdon Elementary School. There are 633 K through 5 students residing in that boundary, and these are Duluth Public School students. This does not take into account any private or charter school students or anything like that. So of those 633, in that sort of top left corner, the bold number 535 of those attend at their home elementary school of Congdon. So that means 98 students are attending some other school. We can see that 35 of them are attending the Spanish Immersion Program at Lowell, and 9 are attending the Ojibwe Immersion. And then just looking across, 26 are attending Myers-Wilkins, and you can see the numbers at the other schools. And then going down in the Congdon row, this shows how many students actually live in that boundary. So there's, attend at that school. So there's 594 students attending that school. Again, that bold number, 535 of those live in the boundary, and 59 are transferring in. So of the total live-in to the attendance, there's roughly a net loss of 40 students or so with the transfers out and transfers in. And the just to make you aware, the out-of-district unmatched students at the bottom, those are students that either were matched to an address outside of the district that are open enrolling into that school, or for one reason or another, we were not able to match their address. So it wasn't provided, or it's a P.O. box number, or something like that. So people usually find this to be a pretty interesting chart when they can see the numbers that's actually happening. And in the case of some of our discussions with what's happening with the Spanish and Ojibwe immersion programs, it was just a good reference to see where those students were attending from.
Thank you, Matt. We have a couple questions here. One just comment I want to say is that a few years ago, during one of our Think Kids committee meetings, as we went out to communities and community groups and schools, some of this same type of information was distributed to get parents thinking of how many kids attend and where they're coming and going from each school. And was that what year was that data from? 2016. 14, yeah, okay, so but this is much more greater detail, and it is really interesting. Member Sandstead?
Yeah, that relates to my question, which is we just are using present data here. We didn't look back to sort of see if there have been any trends in the last few years in terms of movement or numbers.
For this process, we're looking at a current snapshot.
Okay.
We did, Member Sandstead, when after that series of Think Kids meetings and we got community input, and again, some of the dive that people did was looking at moving in and moving out for each school, and we did make changes to our transfer policy based on that at that time. Did you have a follow-up question?
I have an unrelated question. Superintendent, are the AEO students reflected on here? Did we count them?
The AEO would not be on here. Most of the students, our students who are in AEO, only take 1 or 2 classes, and so they're counted in their home site.
And again, AEO is our online program. So if we could avoid using acronyms, being we have a lot of folks here. Thank you.
Okay, so we already kind of touched on some of these boundary considerations already, but when developing the draft scenarios with the working groups, we just kind of wanted them to keep these things in mind, not mandates. We wanted them to be creative and think outside, maybe think outside the box if that's where it kind of took them. We were sort of gathering ideas. But of course, balancing utilization and demographics. We've already talked about the imbalance at some of the schools. You currently have one racially identifiable school at Myers-Wilkins. We couldn't get into a scenario where we were making an additional racially identifiable school, and if we could improve the numbers at Myers-Wilkins, that would that would be beneficial.
Just for the public's understanding, Superintendent Grunstead, do you want to just highlight what that means to be a racial identifiable school, just for clarification?
Sure. Whenever you have a school that is 20% above the district average for diverse populations, it is considered a racially identifiable school. So, for instance, our district average for the elementary, and it's by level, elementary, middle, high school. The elementary district average is 24%. So any school that would have 44% or higher would be considered racially identifiable.
Thank you.
Okay. Also aligning of feeder patterns. Again, Lowell and Myers-Wilkins currently split, where portions go to one middle school and the rest goes to a different middle school and then on to different high schools. So we had We had many options that eliminated any sort of split at middle or high school. Trying not to split neighborhoods. Again, some of the neighborhoods are so large or already split, but trying not to create options that further split neighborhoods. And we created planning units, which we'll talk about in a minute. So we intentionally created these planning units to align to the neighborhood boundaries that we had. And aligning to geographic features, trying not to have, crossing major roads or railroads. That was all taken into consideration. We've had many transportation discussions throughout these meetings, and proximity to school. Obviously, we would love to send every student to their geographically closest school, but I'm sure as I'm talking through these, you can see how some of them probably butt heads. If we're going to, balance utilization and demographics, is it feasible to send every student to their geographically closest school? Probably not. And again, the immersion programs at Lowell, and we'll get into more specifics about that. So,
this might be a
Go ahead, Member Lowell.
A pre-question, but if the immersion programs garner students from all across our city, how does that work to make the middle school and high school split work if within the immersion, or how would that work? Is that too soon of a question?
Superintendent Gronsett?
Right now, the immersion students would go to what would be considered their home middle school and high school.
I get that, but if it's a different high school or middle school, then what the rest of, if you want to make Lowell, if one of our criteria was to make Lowell not split, then the immersion kids come from all over, so they're going to split. Okay.
So again, on October 16th and 17th, we had three different working sessions, roughly 80 participants total. In each of those 3 sessions, they were 4-hour meetings. We depending on the number, we broke them up into, I believe, 4 or 5 small groups, depending on the meeting. And maybe even had 6 at one, and developed the 15 draft scenarios that we talked about for review. So, as previously stated, we broke up the district kind of into planning units to basically to kind of make the work easier for the district, for the working groups, rather than them just kind of going in and starting from scratch and saying, well, hey, what if we moved these 3 blocks from here to here? What does that do? So we developed, I believe it was around a total of 110 planning units. Again, they aligned to your current attendance boundaries, so we didn't want to make a situation where a planning unit crosses 2 of your current attendance boundary. So if you moved it, then you would be creating a change or a split. So based on those 110 planning units, we were able to roll that student data that we gathered up by planning unit and aggregate it by planning unit. So we could tell by planning unit how many elementary, middle, or high school students resided in each of those areas. And then we told the groups what boundary those planning units are currently assigned to, both elementary, middle, and high. And we gave them an interactive Excel tool where they could go in those proposed elementary, middle, and high school columns and click a drop down. And so, for example, in this planning unit 1 is currently assigned to Stowe, and then it gives them a drop down of all the elementary schools within the district, and allows them to assign it to whatever school that they saw fit. So one important thing to mention about this is that the live-in numbers in each of the planning units did not include students that are attending the Spanish or Ojibwe immersion programs from that area, because the assumption is that they will continue roughly at the same rate in the future to attend from those same areas. So we didn't want to, I guess, artificially create a boundary with a higher population than is likely, because there are going to be students pulled out to go to those immersion programs. And then in the tool, based on what's currently taking place and then the different scenarios that the groups developed, we had a current chart that shows each of the schools, the capacity of that school, the live-in enrollment of the current boundary, so based on the grade configuration of each grade level or school, how many, so K-5 students currently live in the Congdon boundary. Again, not including the immersion students. And then based on that, what is the live-in utilization of that boundary? So like we're looking at Congdon up there, capacity 525, live-in enrollment of 571, which is greater than 525. So the utilization is above 100% at roughly 109. And then it has the demographics of those students residing in the boundary, what percentage receive free and reduced lunch, and what percentage are students of color. And then as they were moving the different planning units around between different school attendance boundaries, there was a separate table that updated showing you what the changes were for each of those factors, and then they could compare from the scenario they were developing from the current boundaries.
This is just a comment. I popped in on one of those days and just sat and observed and thanked all the many different volunteers that came out that particular day. And it was really, there was a lot of thoughtful discussion that happened. It was really fun to see how into the process everybody was, how engaged everybody was, and the kinds of questions and clarifications they were asking along the way. Again, just sitting and observing it. It was, what a cool thing. The last time that I was involved as a parent with a boundary study, just like these Lowell parents, we did not have that tool, and we had pieces of paper and lots of sticky notes and lines. So that was a really neat to kind of see it from that perspective. Thank you. Member Eder.
Thank you. Matt, can you speak, Matt, correct? Okay. Can you speak a little bit to what was the criteria for breaking those planning units into pieces? Because the numbers look, just looking through the different numbers of students, they're vacillating quite a bit between what planning units. So what was the criteria for the planning units? So
yeah, they do kind of vary a little bit. I mean, some of them are just, larger areas where they're less dense. Obviously, there's some areas where not very many students reside. So there might be some bigger planning units that look really big on a map but only have 5 students residing in them. So they were developed trying to align to the current attendance boundaries. So if you didn't say move a particular planning unit, it would remain at its current attendance boundary. We really tried to get them to be workable numbers of students, so it wasn't like, I see what you're saying here, and maybe this is a bad example with the numbers we put up there, but number 1 has 106 students in there, but that is the planning unit that's at the very southern portion of the district, right around Stowe, and it was kind of all those students live right around the school, so it was probably unlikely that they were going to change their attendance boundary. But we did try to make it manageable numbers of students, so that when groups were looking at we need to move whatever, 50 students out of this boundary to make it a more manageable utilization, there were different options of how to get at that. It wasn't just, 20 different planning units with 200 kids in it, and if you moved one planning unit, well, you solved that issue, but then you put 200 more students into another planning unit. We did also get the neighborhood GIS shapefile from the county, so we tried to align them to those neighborhoods. Again, some of the neighborhoods are very large and may have 500 students in there, so we had to break those up into more than one planning unit to make it a manageable number. But yeah, that was kind of the criteria.
Can you just kind of explain a little bit more what you got from the county in terms of helping you look at this? Not everyone knows.
Sure. So they maintain a lot of the GIS data for the county. So they actually have shaped what the data we're working with in the GIS software are called shapefiles. So they actually have the attendance boundary geographies. They have a file that shows us the location of all the school points, a file that is all of the roads within the county, parcels. So when we were creating the planning units, we would make sure that in some cases, we tried to take it on, both sides of the road so that, if there was a bus coming down, it would be picking up students on both sides of the street. So having the parcel file was helpful in figuring out, which areas or homes faced certain streets. The neighborhood file, I believe that's pretty much the extent of the data they provided us.
Member Eder?
I have one last question. So, GIS files, you can find out a lot of data, and there's a lot of data depending what the GIS file is. Mm-hmm. So the files that you used, were you only looking at the number of live-in students per those planning units, or did you use any other information other than just number of students when you were making the planning units or throughout this process?
When we were creating the planning units, we weren't strictly looking at how many students. Again, there was some, when we were developing them, we might draw an area and say, that's too large of an area, or that contains too many students. But we wanted to make sure that, again, they aligned to the attendance boundaries and the road, so we were, not cutting parcels in half or things like that. So we did look at those as well. Was that your question?
I guess I'm getting at, other than numbers of students, when were demographics? Did you use any demographic data when you were going through and doing this?
We didn't specifically, it was, so once we created the planning units, we were then able to join all of the student data and aggregate it by those planning units, which included the demographic data. But when we were creating the planning units, we weren't necessarily trying to create a planning unit with a set percentage of a particular demographic in mind.
Superintendent Grunstead, I don't know if you want to just kind of reference for background some of the things that were considered or came out of that last demographic study, where wasn't some of that information used in some of the discussions? I thought I heard.
While we were making the scenarios, there were some people that had been involved with the process in 2017 and had asked for some of the specific data. And so we did pull up that data, and they were taking that into consideration as they were developing their scenarios. What they found was that using the current data that Matt was providing was very similar to what was projected to be the numbers. And so they were able to kind of look a little bit farther down the road and say, this either looks stable or, boy, it's really only supposed to change by 10 students, which isn't going to make a huge difference. So it was helpful in that way.
Thank you. Any other questions? Member Sandsted?
And going forward with that, then, we didn't use any sort of projected numbers of anticipated demographic changes, any, growth sites in the city. We didn't take into account any development like that moving forward, did we?
We did not specifically take those into account in the options that were developed or what we've been working with the focus groups today. I would say, the projections are, and I don't want to speak for the study that was done before, but the projections likely are based on current attendance or attendance boundaries, and with changes, in some cases potentially wholesale changes to the boundaries that could throw off the projection and make a new projection necessary. But in terms of housing, we talked about it in some of the areas, but that's kind of for lack of a better term, a crapshoot of when things are actually going to be developed, and even if they're developed, when they start producing kids, and at what ages, and are they new students to the district, or is it someone moves from a different area in the district? Is it really a new student to your district? So it was not a specific input, and we've kind of been having conversations with the groups as well, is that this is a look at the boundaries that hasn't, it's been talked about, but hasn't really actually been acted upon in, I believe, over 10 years, and it's probably something that, whether or not you're going to change boundaries, is looked at and considered every 3 to 5 years. So if there's major shifts in development in that time, you could probably still be able to look at that and catch up before you're not going to be seeing overnight hundreds of new students.
Go on.
Okay. So I believe we already covered this table. Yes, because I went back. So when giving the groups the tool to work with, based on some of those discussions about Lowell that we've already had, we kind of set it up as two different scenarios. So in addition to the imbalance at Congdon and Lester Park and the imbalance in enrollment and demographics at the middle and high school, we're going to be implementing over the next 2 years, 4th and 5th grade Spanish immersion at Lowell. And we currently have 25 K through 5 classrooms at that school after you take into account art, music, computer lab, pre-K, some intervention rooms and things like that. So currently in kindergarten for the Spanish immersion program, we're filling 3 full sections at 75 students, and from what I'm told, there's even a wait list for those. So once we have K through 5 implementation, again, if everyone stays through the program, there's the potential to occupy 3 full sections per grade. With 6 grades, it's 18 of the 25 classrooms. And we also have the Ojibwe immersion program. I don't believe it is currently occupying 1 class. It's occupying 4, but potentially could have 1 classroom per grade level based on demand. So you can see with the increased implementation of the Spanish immersion program, the challenge that kind of leaves for having a neighborhood program at that school. So when they were developing the scenarios, we kind of gave them 2 different baselines to start from. The first one would be that Lowell would be a Spanish and Ojibwe immersion school only, and then it would still be occupying the majority of that building. for those programs. And with that, that would necessitate the need for assigning those Lowell planning areas to a different attendance area. And then the second scenario we discussed was, or baseline scenario we gave them the option of, was if we move the Ojibwe Immersion Program to a different site, that would free up additional space at that school to still maintain a small neighborhood boundary there. So we gave them the ability to, again, pick from a drop-down of what school site would house the Ojibwe program, and then that would reduce the available neighborhood capacity at that site, since it would be occupying some classrooms there, and free up space at Lowell for a neighborhood boundary. And one other point to mention is that in these planning units, so we currently know how many students are attending the Spanish Immersion Program as it currently is at a K3. So we had already pulled those out, but we sort of projected forward a similar rate once it's fully implemented at 4 or 5. So if a planning unit currently had 10 students attending the Spanish Immersion Program as a K through 3 school, then we assumed once it's fully implemented at K5, that would increase to 15. Questions?
Member Sandstead?
I'm trying to figure out how to ask this in sort of a respectful but also cautious way. How we went about proposing as an option moving the Ojibwe Immersion Program to another site. Because I think that just in general, asking especially our Masabakang folks to consider relocation seems a potentially highly insensitive move. And so I'm wondering, Superintendent, if you can perhaps address that.
There was some discussion. Go ahead.
Sure. Knowing that this was going to be how Matt was going to present this, I wanted to have the opportunity to talk with the staff, and so I did go to the site and first just met with the leaders of the Masabakang program, and then met with all the staff and tried to use culturally responsive practices in our conversations to do so, knowing that it is respectful to offer tobacco or a gift to someone who's going to be considering something like this, and to have some meaningful conversations around it. And so I did do that, and had that pre-conversation before we even started having this conversation, and then followed that up with further conversations with Masabakang leaders and some of the families afterwards.
And could you speak to how that was received?
Well, the tobacco was accepted, and they said that they would consider our conversations and take time to think about that. I think it was well received. They were thankful that we had the conversation. They were certainly concerned, as are the English-speaking parents and the Spanish-speaking parents. Anytime that there's uncertainty, it can be difficult. But I thought that our conversation went well, and then they had staff and parents who participated in the process as well.
Okay, so I'm just going to kind of give a high-level overview of the 4 different scenarios that we've discussed with the groups today, and we'll continue discussing with them tomorrow and Wednesday. So we developed the 4 draft scenarios. We took them through a kind of a similar presentation of what you've seen of a lot of the background data, explained to them how the working groups developed the different scenarios, the tool that they used, kind of like I just walked through with you. And then we printed out some large-scale maps, one of the current boundaries so that they could compare any changes that were made, and then the 4 draft scenarios. And we had them review one at a time in small groups of 5 or so at these tables that were set up. So starting with scenario 1 for about 15 minutes, and then once it had been, fully discussed by each individual group, we stopped and sort of talked about it as a group, and then moved on through scenario 2, scenario 3, and scenario 4. So we had 4 different scenarios.
Can I ask a question on that last slide?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Member Sandstead.
Just to clarify, the live-in utilization numbers, like the 50.9% at Stowe, that's just coming from students attending Duluth schools who are attending Stowe. It's not even considering the students who live in that area but attend outside of the district. Is that correct?
So we do not have information regarding students that attend in other school districts. So,
okay.
So that 280 is the K through 5 students living in the current Stowe boundary.
Okay.
The Duluth Public Schools K through 5 students.
So the 50.9% means that 49% of Duluth public school students who live within the Stowe boundary go elsewhere?
No.
Okay.
It doesn't, no. It's not a percentage of the students attending. It's a percentage of Duluth public school students living in that boundary compared to the size of the building, the capacity of the building.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's not a percentage from the area that attend the school,
okay.
your schools.
So it's capacity more than live-in utilization.
It's
and
both.
But also to confirm, we didn't look at students who are not attending Duluth public schools within our boundaries.
Do you want to clarify that, Superintendent Grunstead?
That is data that we have, but it's not in this number.
And just to clarify, and maybe I'm assuming, but typically it might be data that you have, but it's just aggregated by attendance. We wouldn't actually have it by address, so we know how many students are attending those schools, but not necessarily where they're coming from, but maybe that's incorrect.
Let me provide more clarity. That is tracked through our MARS data, so the state. So we know how many resident students we have being served elsewhere, just like we know how many students we have from elsewhere coming here, because that's all tracked with state identification numbers. What we don't have is private and parochial, because that's not in the same system.
Okay, so we had 4 different scenarios that we presented to the focus groups today to get their feedback. Each of the scenarios, we did calculate or show them sort of the total number of students moved or impacted, but that's really, and that was K through 12, but that was really just saying, if you were to pick up the boundary and move them today, how many students' attendance boundary would be impacted. If there were any sort of policies for students to remain, if they were a rising 5th grader or whatever it is, that would affect how many students are actually impacted. So in this first scenario, it was a scenario where Lowell became a Spanish and Ojibwe immersion school only, did not have a neighborhood boundary. We were able to get the live-in utilization at Stowe up from 50 to 68%, and the numbers at Cogden, while still the highest school within the district, were below 100%. Well, this option reduced the student of color percentage at Myers from 51% to 48%. It eliminated any elementary and feeder splits, and it made the enrollment at the middle schools and high schools more balanced, but based on which feeders fed 100% to which high schools. It actually did not improve the demographics at Denfeld High School and actually made East become a slightly less diverse school.
Member Sandstead?
So under the scenario where Lowell becomes Spanish and Ojibwe only, I could foresee potentially some impact on budgeting if there's implications for Title I dollars that Lowell's currently getting. And I'm wondering what input we've had from our CFO up to this point and going forward in terms of potential financial impact of these scenarios as we're discussing them.
Superintendent Grunstead, if you could also just talk about which schools are Title I schools and briefly again what that means. Thank you.
I forgot the first question. Oh, sorry. It's been a long day of talking so far. We did make sure that district staff was involved both in phase one and tomorrow. I believe CFO Erickson will be with us as the focus group looks at it. And so we're making sure that we have staff from food service, from transportation, from facilities, from finance, looking at all of these from all the different angles to make sure that we're catching everything that we possibly can. I know that even today, with the three groups that we met with, there was a lot of conversation about, so how does that transportation funding work? Or how does this funding stream work? Because different perspectives that are brought into it are thinking of it from different ways. For some of our staff, that's the funding stream that I'm working under. And so it becomes very personal very quickly. And so those conversations are happening along the way. Title I is a federal funding that comes through the state, and a school that has at least 38% of its students receiving free or reduced price lunch services at the elementary or middle school level receives additional funding for that. There are many funding streams that are changed slightly with all of these scenarios because funding follows students, and so looking at the percentage of students who receive free or reduced price lunch could affect breakfast service, summer lunch service, achievement and integration, compensatory, Title I. There are a number of different layers that we have to look at for all of these scenarios to be sure that there aren't unintended consequences.
And can you just highlight again the Title I schools in our district, please?
Sorry, it is Stowe, MacArthur, Piedmont, Myers-Wilkins, Lincoln.
Lowell.
And Lowell. Thank you. Oh. Did I get them all?
Denfeld.
Denfeld, although we don't do funding at the high school level with title.
Thanks. I think that's a really important element here where, especially if we're making our schools, if we're going to be able to eliminate any racially identifiable school or sort of equalize the distribution of students with financial need among the schools, that's a great thing. it also may mean impact on Title I, Comp Ed, things like that. So just something that we, I think, need to be aware of as we're considering options. The note here on all elementary schools feeding 100% of the same middle and high school, I'm wondering if that includes or excludes the immersion programs at Lowell, which would be the only programs at Lowell under this scenario.
Yes, so in this scenario, they would, since there's no current continuation of those programs or boundary for that school at middle and high school, then they would feed their zoned school.
Oh, so they would still be going to the different middle schools.
So it would be the attendance boundaries that would be feeding 100%.
I want us to consider the wisdom of perhaps having fluent Ojibwe and fluent Spanish sixth graders and trying to educate them in two different sites, when perhaps if we can concentrate them at one site, it might be a lot easier to provide follow through education. So,
Go ahead, Superintendent Grunson.
I was just going to say that could certainly be part of any decision that we made. I paused because, as Matt said, the school, if it were to be an immersion-only school, then there wouldn't be any boundary to assign to a school. But if we said, students who completed this program, if there were further program developed, my hope would be that in the future we would be really looking for staff for content areas who are bilingual, and it would be a lot easier to have them concentrated at one site to be able to provide those services. That wasn't part of what was discussed here. It did come up in every group, but that's a decision that we could make, is to assign them to a school.
and my thinking is that whether or not we continue any sort of immersion, we can't just go back to offering them Spanish 1 in 6th grade. That's the thought. Even if we don't have ongoing immersion, we still have kids who are going to have high-level language in Ojibwe and Spanish.
Okay.
So the second scenario did leave a smaller neighborhood boundary at Lowell, along with the expanded Spanish immersion school at that site. To achieve that, the Ojibwe immersion school was moved to Stowe Elementary. That decreased the Stowe neighborhood capacity. So then, therefore, a larger portion of that building is being filled without having to expand the boundary even further north, as was done in some scenarios. Also, the probably most radical change of this scenario was looking at Congdon and Myers-Wilkins sort of being one shared boundary, with one of the schools serving K through 2 students and the other school, in this case it would be Myers-Wilkins serving K through 2 and Congdon serving grades 3 through 5 in that sort of combined shared area. When looking at the demographics of doing this, that would increase the demographics at Congdon, but reduce Myers-Wilkins significantly below that 44% student of color that qualifies for a racially identifiable school. So that would eliminate year 1 racially identifiable school in the district. When looking at utilization, they would then range from 76% at Stowe, again, in part not due just to increasing the size of the boundary to capture more students, but some of the capacity of the school would then be used for the Ojibwe Immersion Program. And then with Myers-Wilkins serving a K-2 for that entire area, it would then have the largest live-in utilization percentage at 98.4%. In this particular option, it's not listed there, but the middle and high school boundary utilization is improved, and also the demographics at each school were improved in this scenario. There was a small elementary school split that remained at Lowell, and a new split at Homecroft, as the northern portion of Homecroft in this scenario would continue to feed to east, whereas the majority of the boundary would feed to Denfeld.
Okay, Member Eder?
Can you speak to why, Superintendent Gronseth or maybe Matt, why Stowe was chosen to move the Ojibwe immersion? And then sort of following up on that, not only at Lowell, it has to do with, or the immersion programs at Lowell are very, very important to the school, but also the presence of the school forest is also very important, both in the Ojibwe and in the Spanish immersion. So did that information at all feed into why Stowe was chosen?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to need more. No, I'm just kidding.
Yes, as the different groups were looking at, there were also other scenarios that were involved. Stowe has a school forest. That was an important piece. There was lots of conversation about the importance of the nature learning component of the program. Also, Stowe being near the river and near where they're doing wild rice restoration, and the forest there is actually a little bit larger, and so that was part of it. And Stowe and Lakewood both are reinventing their focus on environmental education and nature education, and so that also played into it. I know that there were some conversations between Masabakong staff and Stowe staff before that was even listed as a scenario, and so not saying that I think that's exactly the best option, but I wanted to make sure that that Stowe would be receptive of that as well, and so I know that there's been some conversations.
Yeah, and then just one more question. So I'm assuming if Congdon and Myers-Wilkins in this scenario go K through 2 and 3.5, or 3 through 5, excuse me, and now Myers-Wilkins, now we have no racially identifiable schools, so that funding stream probably goes away, but essentially the need isn't going to go anywhere, right? So we're just shuffling things around, but the need for the students is still going to be there. So can you speak to that a little bit?
It's like you've been in all these conversations. Those are certainly common phrases in all the discussions of all the groups, that although we're changing these numbers, we're not changing the needs of the students, because many of them have started off behind, and just because some numbers changed doesn't mean that they suddenly have the skills that they were missing prior. And so, there's been a lot of conversations about, it's difficult to have conversations about, we know that we would like to improve the demographics of our schools, and there's a lot of people around the table who know what the funding streams are and what those numbers mean, and what stays and what goes, and all of that would be conversations that would need to continue. In this specific scenario, I know that there's going to be lots of conversations about food service, about transportation, about budget, around all of those, because they're there are implications in many areas. If you're going to combine that large of an area, you're now transporting twice as many kids, twice as far. And so there's benefits and there's challenges to all of these scenarios, and that's exactly what these 120 people are doing, is listing benefits and challenges and making sure that we're considering all those things.
And then I just have one quick clarification, because a couple times we've said improve demographics. When we say that, we don't really mean improve demographics, right? We mean just spreading, well, I don't even know what I'm trying to say, but not improve, probably, we don't.
Improve
maybe improve demographic splits or disparities or something. Is that kind of what? Okay, no, and I'm not, I just, in my own head, I need to clarify.
Bring schools closer to the district average.
That's good.
Thank you.
You must do this.
I just had a quick question about that last slide. I'm intrigued by the K through 2/3 through 5, because my children experienced that when they were in elementary school, and all 4 of them, and it was, there were definitely some pros to that. Did that, and again, I haven't looked ahead here, but did that kind of split show up in some of the other proposals, or just this one?
This is the only focus group scenario that has this specific proposal. There, I think maybe more than one of the initial working groups at least considered that. There were definitely one for sure that kind of fully vetted that, but it had definitely been discussed by at least a couple of the groups. Okay.
And then I was just going to mention, back to those October meetings, one of the things I saw and heard a lot of was we did have the principal at Lowell there, the principal at Congdon, at Stowe, as well as parents there as well. So there was a lot of what I observed, a good people speaking towards things like the school forest, which we now have in many schools, which is great, and speaking to, again, some of these issues / concerns. So that was happening that day. Okay. Member Sandstead?
Yeah. Matt, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about what these conversations look like today and tomorrow in terms of, are you giving folks a little bit more detail than these particular scenarios? And then how are you eliciting feedback? What's the format for that?
So they are not just being given bullet points, but they have a 3 by 4 foot map of each scenario printed out, and they can compare it to a similar size map of the current boundaries so that they can look at the changes. It also has the tables on them of the number of students that live in the proposed scenario, how does that impact the utilization and demographics at that building. So we're giving them a short presentation and walking them through the high points of each scenario, but we're not going planning unit by planning unit and describing to them every area that changed. That's kind of what we want them to do as groups, or if we did that, they wouldn't have any time to discuss among themselves. So after the presentation, we split them out into groups of 4 or 5, and then they study as a group scenario 1. We give them some feedback sheets of some things to consider for your discussion, just if they were having trouble, but that has not been the case with any of these groups at all, and certainly isn't meant to be the only things to consider. And then they they work as a group, they write down any benefits or challenges that they've identified, and they have a separate page just for kind of any additional comments that we should maybe be made aware of for that specific scenario. Once each of the groups has discussed that scenario, we then just kind of do a quick report out from each of these groups so that the entire group is aware of the discussions from each of the small groups, and then do the same thing for the remaining 3 options.
You want to go on, continue on with? I'm sorry.
I just want to know if the focus groups that we used in October are the same focus groups we're using now. No.
There's a little crossover as the principals and the district administrators, but I want to say all of the staff that we saw today were new to this, and as well as the parents and students, they weren't involved, so that we get the broadest reach that we can.
Member Sandstead?
I'm wondering, Matt, in your experience, if there's any possibility for mixing and matching. If you find that, this chunk from scenario A is very popular and this chunk from scenario B looks really good, and actually they would work together if you see that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. For this process, never really at any point until we've developed a final recommendation based on all of the feedback we've elicited throughout the process, are we saying, give us feedback on, do you want it to be this option or this option? Even at the open community meetings, it's, here's 3 scenarios, what do you like, what do you not like, and we may ultimately make tweaks to a specific scenario based on that feedback. So, like I said, we have 4 today, maybe we have 2 or 3 when we're moving to the community at large. But it might not be exactly 2 of the scenarios we presented today. It might be a slight change to one or a combination of 2, something like that.
Okay, go on, Matt.
Okay, so the third scenario kind of had the least total impact on changes to boundaries. Again, Lowell remains a small neighborhood and a Spanish immersion school. Ojibwe, again, moves to Stowe Elementary, reducing the capacity of that school. Our range in elementary school live-in utilization is from 76% at Stowe, again, partially due to the Ojibwe program moving there, and a high of 98.3% at Lakewood. The Myers-Wilkins student of color percentage again drops 3% from its current of 51. And the Myers-Wilkins and Lowell boundaries continue to split at the high school. So this option really just kind of solved the immediate overcrowding needs at the elementary school, but really had almost no impact at the middle and high schools.
Member Sandstead?
And there would be no change at Congdon at all under this, is that?
No, there would be change. So all elementary schools are below 100% utilization. I don't have the specific number at that school, but I believe it was closer to 90% in this scenario.
I think you said that all schools under this scenario would be impacted. Is that what you said at the beginning?
I don't believe I said that.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure if every school is impacted. I said this probably has the least amount of impact to the total number of students or boundary areas that are changed.
Okay. Superintendent Grant said then.
There were some changes. I believe it was like 3 or 4 planning units that were shifted in small ways that had larger impacts.
Member Lofold?
I'm just interested how this became even a scenario. Like what happened in our October meetings and all of that discussion that funneled into an option that just seems like not a good option.
There were certainly some of the initial scenarios that did not make large-scale impacts to the middle and high schools. I can't be certain whether it's because they were so focused on the elementary schools and maybe they, you know, it was an afterthought. But there were enough scenarios that kind of had minimal changes to the high school that we thought it should at least be something that we should get feedback on from the focus groups.
Sorry, I was focused on the numbers up there. Go ahead, Superintendent Grunstein.
We've had conversations about boundaries 3 or 4 times while I've been superintendent, and it's never an easy discussion, and there's always strong feelings. We're talking about our schools, and we love our schools, and our kids go to these schools, or I went to the school, or it's an emotional thing because our kids are important and education is important. And I think as we've talked to the many people throughout this process, there are a lot of perspectives, and some people would like to see sweeping change that make dramatic differences to how our schools look and feel and function. And there's some who would rather make some small changes so that we can continue what we're doing but have a little more elbow room. And we've heard from a lot of people on both sides of those. Some people that are really impressed with the amount of change that happens with this one, and someone else says, oh my goodness, we couldn't possibly take on all of that. Let's do something smaller and do this. Let's do this again in 3 years and then make another shift. And so I think it is important to have kind of all of it represented here. Some of these do make sweeping changes to how our schools look and feel and function for our students and our staff and our community, and others makes those small changes to get us by with what we're doing. So that's why we thought it would be good to have both.
Okay, and then the last scenario 4, I believe, looking at, again, current student populations, had the largest impact to the student numbers. Lowell Elementary, again, in this scenario, would be a Spanish and immersion language school only. The elementary schools live-in ranges from 68% at Stowe, and then 97% would be the highest at Lakewood. In this particular scenario, the Myers-Wilkins students of color percentages would drop more than the 3% we discussed in scenario 1 and 3, so 6%. And then again, this scenario feeds all elementary schools 100% to the same middle and high school, and it not only balances the enrollment, but brings the middle schools and high schools closer to the district average as a whole. And you can see with the number of students impacted, a lot of that is actually at the high school level. This does have a pretty big change at the high school level, where Myers-Wilkins would be feeding 100% into East Middle School and High School, and Holmcroft would be feeding 100% into Lincoln and Denfeld. So that constituted a large portion of the change at those middle and high school numbers.
Member Soundstead?
The utilization at Lakewood is a number that made me think about whether or not we are keeping in mind classroom space for pre-K at sites in all of these scenarios, at all sites. If you could talk to that.
And we had pre-K early childhood folks as part of the groups, right? Yeah, I thought so. Okay.
So when we were, the capacity numbers that we're using and the utilization percentages that were calculated based off of those do not take the current pre-K rooms into account. So basically, we've kind of pulled those out and set them aside so that there would still be those pre-K rooms available at each of the spaces. And then also at Congdon, which currently does not have a pre-K space, the capacity number we're using has an additional classroom pulled out, so that is a slightly lower capacity to allow us to create a boundary that would support having a pre-K room at that school.
Okay, so in all of these scenarios, each elementary school would have at least one pre-K classroom.
It would either have at least one, or would continue to have the amount that it currently has.
Thank you.
I want to stress that it will have space for one. Doesn't mean that we necessarily have the funding or that all schools are eligible for one. If, some schools can have Head Start, some schools can't. Only certain schools are certified for VPK, so there may be school readiness programs that are available in some schools.
Can you speak to the conversations that happened with any of these scenarios around transportation? And I'm particularly thinking of Lakewood and Stowe and the middle schools and kids coming from different far-reaching areas. I know in past discussions on boundaries, that was always a big discussion about how much time kids should be spending on bus rides, so, yeah.
Sure, and we're only about maybe a third of the way through our focus group conversations, but transportation has come up with every group and every scenario, whether it's sensitivity to people who are living in Center City and don't have access to transportation to go to other sites, or their access to get to school should they move to another school, or talking about going from the backside of Island Lake to Lakewood or other areas. Conversations about the immersion programs and the access to Stowe, for example. All of those conversations are going on. They'll continue. I think one thing that we can say for certain is that the final recommendation that you'll see at the end isn't here yet. There has to be more feedback, more input, and more tweaks. I think we heard that today from groups. They had great feedback, and to Member Sandsted's point, people are saying, well, I like this part in 2 and this part in 4. Can you make those 1? And, those are the kinds of conversations that are going on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Just before we go on, any other questions? Any board members? Okay. Go on, Matt.
So that is really kind of where we're at right now. We've had the focus groups with the initial 4 scenarios. We're continuing with those all day tomorrow and into Wednesday morning. Again, we'll have those open community meetings late January, 22nd and 23rd. We will likely be putting all of the materials and our survey online prior to that meeting to give people a chance to review and provide comment even before those open meetings. And again, we'll take all of that feedback we've had throughout this entire process into consideration following those community meetings and into developing our recommendation for spring of 2020.
Member Sandsted?
If there are changes recommended and accepted in spring 2020, would those go into effect fall 2020 or 2021?
I think it will depend on the final recommendations. If we end up making some small tweaks, I think that we could put at least part of this in place in the fall. If we are talking about large sweeping change, then we need to take more time.
Can you speak to any conversations that have been had or examples of, we used to call it grandfathering in, families and kids to certain schools? And can you speak towards that?
Sure, that has been part of the conversation as well. I know in the past it's been really, we try not to take students out of a school when they have 1 or 2 years left. So, for instance, if you have a fifth grader, they're not going to go to another school for fifth grade, but you'll plan for some transition. Same is true for eighth graders or juniors or seniors. You don't really want to have them go to another school for their final year of school. And so that would all be part of a transition plan that would be developed once we decide where we're going.
It's just a question I know that has came up from parents and particular people who have been engaged in this process over the years. So, yep. Member Lowell?
Just an overview to it that I appreciate the presentation and all of the work. It's exciting to listen to the work. I guess I feel like I'm out of the loop for being a school board member. It's like I feel like I should be integrally connected, but I'm appreciative for the hard work and then we get to come and see it. But I guess I thought I'd get a little bit more detailed about but I'm okay with it, but where the high school where we gained 500 and some high schoolers in scenario 4. Now I know your focus groups are getting that, which I'm glad. Or that, I know that you narrowed it down to 4, but I'm kind of one of those that, I would have been in a focus group that had very much creativity. I'm wondering if there was, I thought maybe I would see, the split with Myers and Congdon, I thought I'd see more of that, equaling out the high schools as well, of either, some other scenarios besides just a boundary shift for our high schools or not. I don't know. I just thought that, yeah.
Well, the focus is on boundaries, so we do need to keep that in mind.
I thought the focus was on equal populations and building utilization as well. So there's I don't know. Just kind of wondering if there was more.
There were 15 mostly unique options, and maybe I can think of one other sort of more unique scenario, but it also has to kind of be a viable scenario, so that was maybe why it wasn't presented to the focus groups.
My question is, are we as a board going to have another update before the community meetings, or when would our next update as a board be?
We can certainly discuss that. I don't know if it would be more beneficial to have it prior to the community meetings, or maybe we could do an additional one before the final presentation after the community meetings, where we could present some of the feedback from the online surveys and what we heard at the community meetings.
Member Eder?
Superintendent Gronseth, just for my own clarification, so 2 of the scenarios talk about moving the Ojibwe Immersion Program out of Lowell and to Stowe, and you said that after these, so I guess I need clarification on the timeline. So after these scenarios were brought forth as a possibility of one of these 4 scenarios, is that when you went and approached to talk about what impact this would have, by giving tobacco and then my second question is, just for clarifying, so when you approach the relevant community members about this process, did they say that they would agree to have the conversation, or can you kind of clarify that for me? Because this sort of, the idea coming out of moving the Ojibwe programs out without significant buy-in from the community that impacts it it makes me very uncomfortable. So I would just like a little bit more clarification on that, if you could give that to me. Thank you.
Sure. I approached them and spoke with them before we had the phase 1 meetings, knowing that it was going to be a part of their conversation. And my wording was for them to consider the conversation that was going to be happening. So is that enough?
Yes, that answers my question. Thank you.
Is there any other comments, questions, board members? Okay. Matt, anything else you'd like to add to us? Thank you.
No, just thank you for having me here tonight. We've had some really good conversations already today. We're going to get a lot more feedback tomorrow, and I think we're really on a good track right now.
Thank you. I would just like to reiterate something Vice Chair Lowell said about these meetings that are already on the schedule for January 22nd and 23rd. While we don't have all the details of them yet, I'm sure we will soon, but let's do our job as board members in terms of just turning people out to them and encouraging participation in whatever ways that through our own networks. We all have a lot of different networks, and I am confident that as they're being set up, the locations and some of the thoughtfulness, just from what I've experienced in the past or I've seen happen in the past, will happen in terms of making them a variety of opportunities. And so I guess I say that, and then Member Lowell.
Just on that same vein, is there thought yet or of doing kind of multiple times in those 22nd, 23rd, like a few different times, or are we just doing evening meetings? Or is it too soon to even talk about that?
The scope of our contract would include 2 community meetings and then the online opportunities for surveying.
Would we have some paper copies of the surveys that could be accessed at the different schools? Okay.
Yeah, we can certainly provide any additional materials. Like we said, the online survey will be up for multiple weeks, as well as the supporting documents to allow to review and answer the online survey. But we can certainly make a PDF version available if you wanted to print it and hand it out and send us back the results, and we can include that.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? I just want to say that I think of the board members here, I'm the only one who has been a parent long enough in the district to have gone through this over 10 years ago when boundaries were changed some, and sat just like many of these Lowell parents did through many meetings to follow it. And I'm really glad again that you're here and that parents are engaged in lots of different ways in the planning, the different meetings and that have already been held, that there's been a lot of parents with lots of different perspectives and backgrounds. That's been was exciting to see. And I know many of us as board members passed on a variety of community members we thought would be helpful to this process. And I as Superintendent Grunset said, this can be very emotional for lots of different reasons, and that was one of the reasons why, as a board, we brought in an outside consultant to work with us who does this kind of work as well, and so, thank you again for how you're approaching this and keeping us updated as you have today. So, any other comments? Okay. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Oh, you don't have to? Okay. With all our new meeting things, I'm just covering my bases here. So, okay, then just leave, everybody. Okay.